Good evening again, and welcome to another Torah class. And this week we studied a portion of Shelach in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, beginning chapter 13. In this week's portion, we read about the spies that Moshe have sent out to scout the Holy Land and find out if the land is good, what kind of people live there, and how best will they be able to conquer the land. We all know, I hope everyone knows, that at the end, 10 spies came back with a negative report telling the Jewish people that it will be impossible to conquer the land, while two, Joshua and Caleb, came and reported a positive report. The Jewish people listened and accepted the report of the 10 spies, and they cried that they want to go back to Egypt. God is very angry. He punishes the Jewish people to wander for 40 years in the desert. The reason they wander for 40 years is because the spies spent 40 days scouting the land, and for each day they will wander 1 year in the desert. Anyone, all the men from the age of 20 and up will die, and every year anybody who reaches the age of 60 will also perish, until 40 years later the younger that was under 20 is already 60 years old, and those are the people that enter the Holy Land. So far, this is a summary of the story of the spies. I want to share with you a few points, some of which are simple understanding of the story that gives us lessons in our day-to-day life, and some are the Kabbalistic insight into the story that also lend to many, many teachings in our day-to-day life. So the first, everybody is asking, what was the scene of the spies? They were asked to go on a mission, scout the land, and return with a report. We don't find that they lied. They were not accused by Caleb and by Moshe as liars. We don't find that they exaggerated. All they did is they reported what they saw and how they understand the situation is. And the outcome they felt is, the result is that they will not be able, the Jewish people will not be able to conquer the land. Why were they punished so severely? So there are several answers. The following is the understanding of the Rebbe in Rashi. Rashi said that something is peculiar in the order of this week's story to last week's last story. Last week's portion, the last story, if anybody remembers, is about Miriam. Miriam, who spoke inappropriately against Moshe. Miriam also didn't lie. She heard something, she reported it to Miriam, and she passed judgment on Moshe. She reported it to Aaron, and she passed judgment on Moshe, deciding that Moshe is behaving inappropriately. Immediately thereafter, we read about the story of the spies. Even though it happened in close proximity, it actually happened within 3 weeks after Miriam was punished for speaking evil and being quarantined for a week. But ordinarily, the Torah will not put together two negative stories next to each other. Usually, the Torah will make a break between the two stories of Miriam's ill speech and the spies' bad report. The fact that they appear next to each other, says Rashi, there is a reason. And the reason is the spies have watched and saw what happened to Miriam by observing and reporting what she saw and coming to a conclusion. Yet the spies did not take to heart the message, the lesson, and acted in the same vein. Even though Miriam did not persuade the entire Jewish people to go against God, even though Miriam did not speak publicly against Moshe, the spies' sin is much harsher because they did it publicly and they went and rebelled against God. However, the core of their sin is exactly the same. Seeing something and coming to a conclusion and continuing on to share it with others. I believe that the point that Rashi is teaching us is sometimes misbehaving is inappropriate, but misbehaving that is copied from someone else's same act makes it a lot worse. Had the spies committed that crime, not after Miriam's crime, God might have forgiven them and given them a second chance. But because it happened after Miriam's sin, now God says, why didn't they take note? Why didn't they learn from their mistake? Somebody told me this week that everybody makes mistakes. The difference between the smart and good people is, what do they do with the mistake? For the foolish people, they will only repeat the mistake. For the wise men, they learn from their mistake to make sure they do not repeat. And here we see the punishment is very harsh. Part of the reason is, instead of taking note and learning from the mistake, they repeated the same sin. And that's why God's wrath was so harsh that they died immediately and the entire Jewish people ended up in the desert for 40 years. So this is the first point that I would like to share. The second one, in the second verse 2, chapter 13, in the Chumash of that we study is page 941 on Numbers 13, 2 and 3. We read the following text. Moshe sent them by the word of God from the desert. This is text number 3, by the word of God. However, if you read text 2 first, you see it differently. We read, God says to Moshe, saying, send out men for yourself to explore the land of Canaan. So the question is, who appointed the spies? Was it Moshe's appointment, sent for yourself, or God appointed them, as we read in text 3, Moshe sent them by the word of God? Rashi said that Moshe came up with the idea after listening to the Jewish people's request. When God heard the request, he said to him, if you want to do it, you may as well, and I give you my blessing. In other words, the initial idea came from Moshe. However, after Moshe requested or asked for it, God accepted it and obliged and gave his blessing. The Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that is the relationship in every Jew to God. In a relationship, just like a healthy relationship between husband and wife, parents and children, employer and employees, partners, there are 2 tracks. There are 2 ways in which the relationship can follow. One, the Jewish people to God. One is we follow God's commandments. We have code of law which sets forth the required behavior and sets the fence in which we should not cross and what is forbidden. This is one way. Then comes a second way of a relationship in which we act in a kind way to please God, and we refrain from acting in ways that we assume God will not be happy. In a relationship, usually the classical example is a husband and wife. There are written rules. there is no disrespect, setting up rules about eating habits, going to bed, going to work, how do we talk to one another. But then there is another track, another way of communicating, which actually may be a much, much more pleasant and achieve a lot greater bonding. And that is the unwritten rules. Those acts that bond the relationship on a much different level, much higher level, which the spouse appreciates far greater. Both type of relationship are expressed in the story of the spies. On one end, Moshe Rabbeinu is coming up with the idea on his own, but later God puts it in the Torah and makes it part of the rules. We need to know that in our relationship to God, there are rules that we must follow, but that should not stop us there. We must find ways to please God by going above and beyond the requirements. We must stay away from negative behavior, even if the Torah does not prohibit it. Even if God does not specifically make it prohibited, it is incumbent upon us as people who are married or connected to God in the greatest way possible to make that relationship a much, much greater relationship. And I want to move into the next point. We read upon their return, the spies, 12 spies are returning. We read on verse 26, they came to Moshe and to the entire Jewish camp, and they showed them the fruits they brought. And they said, we came to the land and it's also flowing with honey and milk, and this is the fruits. However, the people that inhabit the land are very, very mighty, very powerful. The cities are fortified, and we saw giants. In addition, Amalekite is sitting not far from there, and Hittite and Jebusites and Amorites are camped in the mountain, and they are well prepared, and it will be virtually impossible to conquer the land of Israel. This is the 10 spies report. Immediately on verse 30, on page 946, we read that Caleb silenced the people to Moshe. Then he said, we will definitely go up. We will take possession of the land. We don't see what Caleb silencing respond to the spies was. He silenced them, the Torah tells us, but we don't read in the Torah in what way. How was he able to refute the spies' report that was okay to enter the Holy Land? Rashi answers this question in the following way. Rashi said that Caleb said to the people, how dare you refute or dispute Moshe, who took us and made us cross the sea, provided us with manna, and gave us the quail as meat for consumption. And if he did so much for us, then he definitely is able to bring us to the Holy Land. The Rebbe is asking, where did Rashi get the idea of those three ideas that Caleb used? And in what way does he refute the spies? And here is the Rebbe's understanding. The Rebbe said that if you pay attention to the complaint of the spies, you find that it's divided into three major complaints. The first is the people within the land. Those people that inhabit the land of Canaan are very, very well prepared, very well trained. They have a very strong and mighty army, and it's impossible to win over the army encamped inside the land of Israel. Second, they said that's where they started. They say because the people in the land are extraordinarily powerful. They have a very strong army. It is impossible to conquer the land inside. The second point they made is that the cities and nations surrounding the Holy Land are very mighty and very strong, and it will be impossible to cross those nations. That's why they bring up the story of Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites that are encamped in the mountain, and the Canaanite is on the ocean and next to the Jordan. What they are talking about is that you don't even have the ability to get into the border of the Holy Land, because all the nations surrounding the Holy Land are very mighty, very fortified, and very well trained, so there is no chance. And finally, they bring the story of Amalekites. You know why they bring the story of Amalekites? To remind the Jewish people of their experience with them a year earlier when they fought the Amalekites, and Amalekite was able to capture and kill very few men, but he was a very strong, mighty nation, the only nation that was able to fight the Jewish people and stop them, and so to say, capture some of their men. And that's why they said to the Jewish people, remember the Amalekites? We weren't able to be successful against them, and they are right there waiting for us. So again, the spies had used three reasons why they should not be continuing to the Holy Land. Reason number one, the people inside are very strong. Reason number two, the nations around the country, outside the country, are very mighty, and we won't be able to cross. And reason number three, the Amalekites, which we had a very bitter experience with just a year ago, is also out there waiting to start a fight again. Says the Rebbe, Caleb, when he silenced the people, Rashi said, he brought in three examples where Moshe was able to perform miracles. The first is when they crossed the sea. He turned to the people and he says, don't you remember? He split the sea for us. Says the Rebbe, you know what happened in the splitting of the sea? The Egyptian army, the mightiest army of all nations, was sunk, was drowned in the sea. So the fact that you're worried about the armies of the nations living in the Holy Land should not deter us, because Moshe performed a miracle by drowning an entire nation's army, and it happened to be the mightiest army at the time. The second excuse the spies used was the nations encamped outside the Holy Land, and they are all prepared to fight. Says Caleb, don't forget that Moshe is bringing us the manna every day in the desert. He performs many miracles in the desert. He surely will able to make them go away. And when it regards to Amalekites, the spies were reminding the Jewish people that the reason Amalekite was successful in conquering some captives is because the Jewish people lost their faith in God. Anybody who's familiar with the story of the Amalekites, we read in the Torah, Ve'ata ayef ve'yagea, the Jewish people are very, very tired, ve'lo yareh Elokim, and have no fear of God. And that's when Amalekite was able to hurt the Jewish people. And the spies turned to the people and says, right now we are not fearing God. We have no fear of heavens. And therefore there is no chance that God will be with us to protect us if we try to conquer the Holy Land. That's the point they were trying to make with Amalekites. Says the Rebbe, Caleb's response is, remember the quail? If you read the story of the quail, it was last week's Torah portion, we read that the people who are complaining and have no fear of God, and yet they demanded, they wanted the quail, because if there is no quail, they remember the free watermelon and leek and garlic and onion. They want to go back. They rebelled and about to return back to the Holy Land. That's when we read about the quail coming. Says Caleb to the Jewish people, what are you afraid of? You have no faith in God, so He won't be there for you? Just don't forget the story of the quail Moshe brought us, even when we lacked fear of God. Yet God was compassionate enough to save us and provide our needs. You have no reason to fear. So according to the way the Rebbe explains, Caleb is responding to every one of the three reasons used by the spies. Then Caleb says, we surely will be able to conquer the land. And as the Torah tells us, Caleb turned to them and says, even if we need to build ladders and climb to the heavens, we will do that, because if Moshe said so, we surely are going to reach that point. And I think that this is a very important point, because the way you look at it, the way Caleb saw it and the way the spies saw it was two opposites, and yet we know the end result was Caleb's vision. One more. We just read that Caleb's silence. The following is a Hasidic lesson from the same story I just shared with you, which I think is wonderful. We read that Caleb silenced the people. One can ask, by which right does he have to silence the people? After all, they were sent out on a mission. They were leaders in their community. They were chosen for their righteousness. And all they did was give a report. They did not lie, as mentioned before. How does he have the right to silence them? At least let them finish saying whatever they wanted to say. Says the Rebbe, the Hasidic insight to it is the following. When Moshe is appointing the spies, the order matters much more than you can imagine. He turned to them and he says, scout the land, see how the cities are fortified, and only after they find out about the people and the cities, he concludes, Ve'it chazaktem, strengthen yourself and bring from the fruit of the land. In other words, the fruit of the land, Hasidic teaching is as the reward to show the people what happens in the Holy Land when they conquer and live in and settle there. These are the fruits, mighty, strong, healthy, juicy fruit. So the order was to give a report, to reach out and find out about the people and the community and the cities, and then bring fruits to show as a reward for conquering and settling in the Holy Land. However, when the spies return, it's so amazing that you read about the fruit of the land first and only about the report, and that's why Caleb silenced them. They start, we came to the land, and they showed the people the fruit of the land. And then they said, we came from the land you sent us, and it's flowing with milk and honey, and here is the fruit. However, the people are very strong and mighty, and the cities are fortified. Says the Hasidic teaching that they were searching for the reward before the toil, before the hard work. In order for someone to follow God's way, they need to put into priority in order. Well, first you put the effort in reaching the goal, and then God guarantees the reward, which is the fruits of the land that comes out after working hard, following God's way. The spies, on the other hand, wanted right away to reach the reward, and that was their focus. And that's why they first show the fruit and first talk about flowing with milk and honey, and only later they start reporting about the inhabitants, the cities, and all the walls that they built around. And that's why Caleb is silencing them, because he said to them, the order, the priorities are messed up, they are wrong, and for that reason, you don't deserve to continue speaking, because it's going to lead you to nowhere. In our day-to-day life, we have many, many occasions where we are tasked and are also going to be rewarded We need to know the priorities. We need to know that what's the priority at hand, and hopefully then reaching our reward which will follow. And I would like one more thing. One is everybody's asking, how is it possible for the spies, such holy people who watch God himself come down Mount Sinai, people who ate the manna every day, people who crossed the sea, watching their enemy drown. How is it possible they rebel against God, saying that God will not be able to conquer the land for us? It just makes no sense. The Kabbalistic interpretation is that they were people who had strong belief in God, but they had a total separation between spirituality and materialism. And they felt that God is great success in the spiritual realm. So as long as they're in the desert and God makes them live a life of miracles, God is able to perform anything he wants. He'll bring the quail every day, bring the manna, he will drown their enemies. However, entering the Holy Land, God, the manna is going to cease. Miracles will not happen. In order for them to find food, they have to toil and sweat and work very hard and compete in the markets. These are natural behavior occurrences. In such a case, God created the system of nature, and God himself will not interfere and not perform any miracles. And therefore they figured God will not be able to help us conquer the land, because we have to fight on our own with our own weapons and our own training and our own way of doing it, and we are unable to against such strong armies. The mistake they had is that they don't realize that God can help even within the nature that God created. And God can, as the Kabbalistic teaching is, God can perform small little miracles, and those little miracles sometimes appear as part of natural system. However, they help those who needed to be helped. And that was the reason that the spies, despite their great faith in God and encounter with God on so many occasions, didn't believe that God can help them conquer the Holy Land and settle in it. But Caleb and Joshua correctly figured that God can do anything and is not limited, including physical boundaries, and he will be able to perform and act miraculously within nature. I'm sorry for taking my time a little longer. It's just that I felt that it's important to share. So I thank you everyone for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again, either Friday night and Shabbat at the synagogue with certain restrictions,